wisdom about the America we all love. So this is The Best People, and this is Ken Burns. Thank you. Well, I'll start by asking you in front of everyone what I asked you in the back, but I'll clean it up because Peter and Lenny are here. Are we going to make it?
Yes.
I'm going to need your evidence-based response.
Yeah. So we were... I mean, first of all, we have three great crises after the creation of the United States: the Civil War, the Depression, and the Second World War. In those instances, free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power and the independence of the judiciary were never in question. There are a lot of things that are unique to this moment with this character that are terrifying, but we were more divided during our revolution, which was not just a revolution, the most consequential in the history of the world, but an incredibly bloody civil war, particularly on this island, particularly in New Jersey, particularly in South Carolina. Way more divided during our Civil War, where we murdered, we now think, well over 700,000 of our own people, and way more divided, I would say, during the period after the Civil War called Reconstruction and its collapse, its terrible collapse that created the Jim Crow system that we seem to be teasing or testing to go back into today, and way more divided during the Vietnam period. I think if you think about it, from 69, for those of us who were around, 69 to 75, there were hundreds and hundreds of bombings that took place. And I would just ask anyone in our media-saturated world, what was the last bomb in America that went off? Was it caught and diffused? Did it go off? Where was it? How many people died? Right? I mean, so one thing you do when you study history is you end up at these different mountaintops in this perpetual range, and you're looking back at things, and it can provide you some stuff. I told you earlier, too, a friend of mine during the '08 meltdown, he's in the financial services and came up to me, Chicken Little, like, the sky is falling, we're in a depression. And I said, in our depression, in many cities, the animals in the zoo were shot and the meat distributed to the poor. If that happens, I'll agree. And then what happens is that there is a tempering of the anxieties that takes place when you study these things. I'll give you something that's not in the revolution. At the very end of the film, as we're struggling over the Bill of Rights and particularly the Constitution itself, and they're trying to reverse engineer against a dictator. And Hamilton is anxious. He says, what if somebody should mount the hobby horse of popularity and create chaos? No man is above the law. He wrote that just in these musings and considerations of what it would be like to build a system tight enough. Jefferson was in Paris, stuck in Paris, writing to his protege, Madison, saying, and I took this out of the film, and I think it's worth having a really healthy debate about, after Trump was reelected, he said to Madison, what if someone should lose an election but pretend false votes and reap the whirlwind? And, it was in there, it had its shock value before, and then I realized I need to reach as many people as possible, and this would just be a kind of, if they'd gotten that far in the film, I could afford to lose them. But there was a spirit of, sometimes you didn't need to put your thumb on the historical scale and say, isn't this so much like him? In fact, our job is to be Odysseus tied to the lash, to hear Circe's siren song, and to be able to go, yep, it's rhyming, but I don't need to point it out. So there are lots of things that will rhyme and lots of things that don't rhyme. And more importantly, to the underlying question is, a lot of things that rhyme in one year don't rhyme again. And that means that there is this constant change. And I've been writing this down for friends and my girls. I have 4 daughters who are the most important co-productions. But I wrote out on Post-its for them in moments of crisis, this won't last. Get help from others, and be kind to yourself. Now, those are essentially psychological in their origin, but they do apply. You can realize that the only thing that's constant is going to be the change, the things that are going to not continue the way they are. And we are in this together. And part of what this divided world does, is it isn't, social media isn't, right? There's nothing social about being on your phone. And everyone else in the room is on their phone doing something else. And so what we need to do is find, as you have created here for decades and decades and decades, a community of conversation, of thought, of civic action. And of course, that's one of the virtues that will save us too, is a kind of energetic and muscular civics that will permit us to sort of live out the true meaning of our creed.
How much of saying yes to the question, will we make it, is rooted in the lessons of history, and how much of it is things you're seeing that are different from anything that's ever happened before?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think both. I think obviously I've given a way long 9-part answer to the first part, but
I love a good filibuster.
Yes, don't end the filibuster, please. I think the other thing is that you begin, there's something lawful about everything. I mean, the first and most difficult for everyone here is none of us are getting out of here alive. There's no magic thing that an exception is going to be made in our case, and we're going to live forever. So you could migrate that a little bit, and Viktor Orban's going to be in Hungary forever, right? And everything that he does will go really well. And so you have the mounting sort of momentum of the fact that, as I've said a few times, that the dog has caught the school bus. School bus always going to win. It's taken a long time, and we're pretty anxious about the school bus. Why hasn't it prevailed here? But I think that there is a sense that pushbacks in lower courts, pushbacks even in the Supreme Court, finally some people being able to say things, the beginning of a new generation of leadership that is rising up saying, you're not doing this well. You're not responding to this well. We're just talking about Texas, Maine, places where really young and really complicated people are coming up and saying, we're going to try something else. All of that suggests that this is unprecedented. One thing I think is to say that helps. It's like you're in the middle of a big party. Your parents are going to come home tomorrow. The place is a mess, right? Do you spend the rest of the party worrying about that? Or you say, okay, my next job when this great party is over is to clean up the mess. Why are we not talking about what restoration and repair looks like?
Because I think a lot of people wonder if mom and dad are coming home.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look at I think that you have such an intimate, tactical, emotional, and intellectual understanding of our history. I think some people think checks and balances. The Congress was supposed to check him, and they are absent.
Yes.
The courts are supposed to check him, and they just gutted the Voting Rights Act. I think people feel like the system hasn't worked.
It hasn't worked, and it's not working. And I think these are the things that cause me great anxiety. I also know that tactile part, the intimate part, is also an awareness of who we actually are across the country. Like, we're talking to a relatively insular audience. I'm really happy to say that the American Revolution series that was broadcast last November is just broken through.
Tell us the numbers.
It's flabbergasting. There's an interesting curiosity out there in the midst of the crisis, in the midst of wanting to be on the floor in the fetal position, sucking your thumb, chicken littling it.
I love that you're looking at me.
That we also know that we have within our power the tools to figure out what that repair and what that restoration does look like. And I think it's beginning to move. It's showing in these little tiny state and Senate and House races in other stuff. Not everywhere. We saw what the fear of retribution did in Indiana, but it's out there, and there's a sense of things. I think you have to understand, you can see it when the big MAGA people break for whatever reason, and their motives are always suspicious to me, Tucker Carlson. I just think he's setting himself up to run for
Me too.
something.
I think he's the nominee in 28.
And so, but I think for a lot of people, you can see in Joe Rogan, hey, I do like habeas corpus. Hey, the immigrants do things. Hey, this is inconsistent. Hey, you promised us not to do this. Hey, you invaded this, inconsistent. Hey, you promised us not to do this. Hey, you invaded this, that those sorts of things have a kind of slow and steady drumbeat, but it's still not enough for us to sit here and be complacent that it's all going to be taken care of by the mass of other people who are getting sick of him. It's going to require everybody to do everything. And I'll give you one other thing that was interesting. Mark Twain once said so many good things. He said, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. And so I have been out on the road for over a year and a half, and I have been saying the same things to everybody. And to the New York Times editorial board and Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn and inner city kids in Charleston and Detroit. And, there's something exhilarating about bringing the same message without having to say, oh, these people are from this, so let me throw them this kind of thing. I hoped to just get to last October, a month before our broadcast, mid-October, before there was some controversy where the what hit the fan, and there would be, criticisms up the wazoo, and I'd have to spend the rest of my life on the road answering those questions first. Nothing. The thing went off. Middle of the broadcast, there were 3 rather desultory, sort of negative things from expected places. 2 of them, they clearly had not watched more than 15 minutes of a show. This is a show, by the way, that thinks the American Revolution is the most consequential event in world history, and that, oh, by the way, there's only one person responsible for its success, and that's George Washington. And we can prove it, and it's very exhilarating for a bottom-up guy like me to go, whoa, it really is him. And it's complicated him, too. He's not all good, and he's not all bad. There's the nature of heroism. None of these things stuck. It just didn't happen. And I just think people want a good story. And this is a really complex story. And if you have, for anything, any imagination, have this idea of the American Revolution from New Hampshire and the Maine district of Massachusetts down to Georgia as being this sort of simple binary, you've really lost it, because it is not that, as nothing is. And it is so interesting and complicated that it makes our founding narrative even more impressive and inspirational. And I think if you're in a crisis, you tend to go back and you find a pastor or a priest and you say, help. And the first thing they want to know is, where'd you come from? And I think going back to that moment, the origin story, the mythologies, the lies, the good things, all bring you to this possibility of what it is. This is a really unique experience. There's no other country in the world that has this. This is often, our exceptionalism is so tiresome, and particularly to the rest of the world. But Lincoln, in his 1862 message to Congress, what we call the State of the Union address, he doesn't address, it was delivered, the Constitution required it. It would be read by the clerk. He said, that we are the last best hope of earth. And he also did 2 really crazy, wonderful things. Can I go into a little Lincoln reverie?
Oh, please.
So he's the best at seeing who we have been, who we are now, and where we could possibly be. I interviewed Stuart Udall about the national parks, and he talked to about Teddy Roosevelt, and he said Roosevelt had distance in his eyes, meaning he could see beyond the horizon, not just of the globe, but of time. And Lincoln had that more than anybody else. And Lincoln in this address says, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. 2 sentences later, he says, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew, we must act anew, we must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country, that country being the last best hope of earth. So how Are they both true? Yes. You know, we are bound to the historical traditions, and we are also in a moment so fraught and ripe with possibility that to disenthrall ourselves is an interesting thing from the man who has just issued the Emancipation Proclamation that's going to go into effect on January 1st in a couple of weeks. That means to stop being a slave, to disenthrall yourself, make yourself a thrall to somebody else. And he's asking the whole country to have this thing. And all throughout his writings, he understands the sense of it. Even as a young man, he said, you know, we're going to live through all time or die by suicide, right? Because we got these two big oceans. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track in the Blue Ridge in the trial of 1,000 years. He's absolutely right.
Did they have a backup plan if the checks and balances didn't hold?
I don't know. The checks and balances didn't hold. We had a civil war that came 5 years after the Declaration, and certainly much shorter period after the Constitution, and even shorter, 2 years shorter from when the government actually started in 1789. They had assumed that some of the compromises that they put in place, which were in many cases quite brilliant to help the smaller states and the larger states sort of reconcile things. But it has the 3/5 clause in it, and it seemed to hold. The South had and was very happy to have a kind of control of the government in not only the executive, but in the legislative for a very long period of time. And then new Western states were being added. And the question of whether they were slave or free, the already moral obligation to speak out against slavery had taken hold. George Washington knew slavery was evil. Thomas Jefferson knew slavery was evil. They're making so much money and so hard to stop. Washington did free his slaves at his death. Jefferson did not, just kept buying wine and French wine and Italian statuary and temporize. He said, holding slavery, slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you dare not let go, which is bullshit. And, and his neighbor, Cole, I think his name was, urged him to free his slaves as he had done. His cousin Randolph had freed his slaves. So it was happening all around, and the moral arguments were hitting a pitch, and it was no longer just, no slavery, it's abolition, let's get rid of it. At that point, the South turns in their whole economic engine is now in question. There are 9 million people in the South in 1861 when the Civil War begins, 4 million of whom, 45%, are enslaved people, zero interest in slavery. And people have spent the last 36 years since my Civil War series came up buttonholing me in various locations about how you say it's about slavery, but it's really about states' rights, or it's about nullification, or it's whatever it is. And you go, please just read the South Carolina Articles of Secession. They say nothing about states' rights. They say nothing about nullification, interposition, anything. They say slavery over and over again. And they've already know that the guy that's been elected with 40% of the vote, president, is a moderate. He's a moderate. He's from the Western wing. He's going to try to keep the Union together, and they're still going to go. The system was already and always has been charged. It should have been, Madison thought it was just a dead letter meant about the Constitution unless the life of the people was brought into it. And that's why the Constitution wouldn't have been ratified if the people who had been fighting for this improbable idea of liberty hadn't insisted that there be a Bill of Rights that would enshrine many of the things they felt they were fighting for. And it's a beautiful period of incredible political, what's the right word, kind of civic engagement, widespread civic engagement, probably the largest in the world up to that time, where you had so-called ordinary people now engaged with what will we make of this thing now that we've done it. But I think they always knew that it was flawed and going to be that way. I mean, you can look at that First Amendment as one of the most beautiful. You could go to the 14th right away, and that's what's being dismantled a little bit right now. And then I'm working on a history of Reconstruction, but I'm also making a film about LBJ and the Great Society, which is where you're getting the first progresses after the Civil War enshrined in the law, in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so we're in this fraught moment where, maybe the lessons of those two films can help us understand just the darkness to which where some of these rulings are leading us will take us to. It is a dark, dark place and an indictment, a wholesale indictment of the United States if we were to go back to what happened at the collapse of Reconstruction by the end of the 1870s and what Jim Crow and lynching and Plessy versus Ferguson and other things meant. It's a dark, dark place to go where you have this unfettered ability to make sure that people of color do not have a chance to vote or make it so difficult that it impedes them from exercising this right.
You have the maximum amount of perspective and information to draw from. I have the least, right? I stare at, my nose is pressed against the glass of the news cycle. So
we all here disagree.
It is true. Thank you. But I just have to ask if you are sort of directly addressing the decision last week from the Supreme Court to get the Voting Rights Act, and if you think that one decision, or do you think it is the multiple rulings that effectively gut the Voting Rights Act?
Yeah, I think last week was just a gut punch for many of us. And I think that my feeling is to not put a label on it and say, okay, it's the biggest one of many certain things. It's like, I can tell you times when it is so much darker. Maybe that's the way to say it. So much darker than we could ever possibly imagine in our history. And I don't mean just way back then when they had breeches and powdered wigs and no photographs. I mean, in our lives, in the lives of photography and filmmaking. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Americans woke up, as Dwight Eisenhower said in his announcement, liberty-loving Americans woke up and they'd heard that it happened. They knew nothing. There were no from the beach reports. There was nothing. No one knew what had happened to their brothers and their sons and their husbands. And that night, FDR gave one of the most beautiful prayers, the D-Day prayer. And he said, that we may not win at once. The enemy may hurl back our forces. There's a sense now that if we live in a computer age where everything is a 1 or a 0, or in a media culture where everything is a simple binary, that everything's either good or bad. But it's all a process. That's the opening of the 6th episode. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch to come after that, and there's a way lot before that. But that was a good way to begin the last roundup, the last thing.
I think it makes me cry, though, because this idea that it was a global event, this is something you always think about, right? You think it's our story, but it was a massive event the world over.
Explain. So this is maybe the 5th World War over the prize of North America. When you say prize, you mean Indian land, so that's another thing we have to be conscious of. It's also... It's interesting, there's nobody alive that doesn't know that when that document is issued from Philadelphia on July 4th, that says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, we know that they mean all white men of property free of debt. But it doesn't mean that every other person who's been hearing for the last 20 years, as Jane Kaminsky herself says, the liberty talk is leaky. As you're reading the newspaper, reading the Walpole, New Hampshire, where the town I live, Gazette, which is read all the way down in Georgia, and you're reading these ideas that are being passed around, and this liberty thing is such a amazing stuff. People say this is hot. People have ears. They all knew. And Maggie Blackhawk, who's a legal scholar at Yale, said that the Declaration was deeply significant to people at the margins, women, the poor, enslaved and free, African Americans and Native peoples who were both assimilated, trying to coexist, and of course hoping to forestall the inevitable, because those world wars are the prize and they want it. Look, they didn't put Washington in charge of the Eastern Seaboard Army. Let's just put it that way. The Continental Congress put him in charge of the Continental Army. They knew exactly where they were going. They knew what they wanted. They knew California was out there. And so there's a complexity to that, and yet this is the Enlightenment. So the disagreement between English, and we sort of made the revolution just, it's them against us. We don't acknowledge the number of people, particularly in New York City, who are loyalists, who are, why would I change? All my prosperity, all my education, my good health, the property I own, whatever it is, has come from the British constitutional monarchy, which arguably in terms of European Western sensibilities could be considered the best form of government, certainly not repressive the way the French are. So why would I change that for some completely new and untried idea? But that new and untried idea had been incubating, maybe not articulated as an idea, but incubating because of the distance of 3,000 miles and the age of sail. Some parliamentary person said that we treated the North American colonies with salutary neglect. That salutary neglect grew this passion for that, and that passion was for everyone there. And it's hard to say this because it took 49 years for the 13th Amendment and took 144 years for women to get to vote. Native American sovereignty is still an issue, but it was done. It was done the moment those words were let loose. And he says that's Jefferson, a couple phrases later. He says, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, which is easy to parse. It just means that heretofore everybody's been under an authoritarian's boot. We put up with that. The trains are running on time, we're told, so things must be good here in Italy under Mussolini, right? But we're creating something else, which are citizens, and it's going to take extra effort in order not to just suffer evils while evils are sufferable. This is one of the greatest sentences ever written in the English language. But just that idea that it is in our nature to sort of, what is it, how many grandmothers does it take to screw in a light bulb? None, I'll sit in the dark. That there's that tendency to just suffer while evils are sufferable. And we do have this mechanism to say no.
What is the I don't want to mix metaphors here, but what is the switch then in your study of humans that makes us turn the lights on?
Yeah, this I do not know. I am trying to figure this out. We follow a loyalist all the way through. He forms a regiment and he's in a losing battle, kills his best friend growing up in a losing battle. There's a kid, Joseph Plum Martin, who's from Connecticut, 15 years old, who signs up a couple of days after the Declaration. Signs up. And he's first-blooded here in Long Island, which is the biggest and the worst battle of the Revolution for patriots in many, many respects. Why did he do that? He's 15. He will be going over the rampart at Redoubt number 10 at Yorktown in October of 81. His boss, Joseph Plum Martin's boss, is Lafayette, who's nowhere near there, and Alexander Hamilton, who's not there. They're grunts doing this work. And how did they know? Because they didn't mean for these rights. They wanted a republic of an elite. But somewhere along the line, it began to change, and democracy was not the intention, but the unintended consequence of this fight. And what propels people, James Fortin, here's the Declaration read, a free black kid, 9 years old, on the 8th, I think, of July in Philadelphia, first public reading of the Declaration. And he didn't for a second think that it didn't mean him. He just went out, joined the Patriot Navy, was caught. He spends the rest of the war in the Jersey, which is a prison ship that the British have in the East River that is the worst of the worst of the worst. He's a young kid, so he survives. He walks home barefoot to Pennsylvania. Mother can't believe he's alive. He basically makes a fortune in the sail business in the Merchant Marine, and he funds The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's, the first abolitionist newspaper, James Fortin did. And I'm going to cry, his granddaughter Charlotte came down to the Sea Islands of Georgia after the Union took control of the Sea Islands to try to figure out how to take, not yet emancipated, not yet free, but not under enslavement, Black Americans, and to figure out how they could have schools and how they could plant crops, how they could own their own properties, how they could build their own churches and communities together. So just the animating thing. There's a guy who surrenders at Yorktown named Johann Ewald, this German Hessian. He's openly contemptuous of this stuff. He calls us a rabble. He calls us worse. But he's in the surrendering army at Yorktown, and he says, who would have thought 100 years ago that out of this multitude of rabble could arise a people who could defy kings?
तेरी तारीफों से रुकता नहीं, शाही लिखावट के हर पन्ने में तकदीर है, सहमासा हूँ तुझ में, मानो तू ही मेरी तकदीर है क्या? प्यार वजह तू दिल की है, पुकार मेरी के सफर में कोई गुस्सा नहीं हो, दूरी तुझसे कितनी तेरी तारीफों से रुकता नहीं, शाही लिखावट के हर पन्ने में तकदीर है, सहमासा हूँ तुझ में, मानो तू ही मेरी तकदीर है क्या?
कि मुझे सामने पाँव में हम खड़े हैं देखा के राहों में, ये दिल को आके फिर से तू भी थाम ले, हम भी हाथों में तेरे ही नामों के अभी जाम ले, कर ले बातों में तेरे